So he loved to tell that story about having voted 3 times in one election, although I think it might have cast some doubt on people he told about whether he really was the most trusted man in America. But it certainly validates that it was that kind of environment that the citizens of Kansas City were dealing with at the time. And interestingly enough, there was ambivalence about the Pendergast regime among many of the citizens. A leading newspaper at the time editorialized that an open city brought tourism and thus increased financial viability for the community. As described by one civic observer, it was difficult for Southsiders, those in the more affluent neighborhoods, to understand the magnitude of the problem as they lived in a part of the city that did not daily encounter the corruption. An apt description of this ambivalent attitude toward Pendergast and his machine was reflected in the words of Maurice Milligan, former U.S. attorney for the Western District of Missouri, when he wrote, quote, "I think it can be said without exaggeration that the people of Kansas City accepted Pendergast as the visible symbol of their pragmatic philosophy of live and let live. They took a certain amount of pride in him." There was also continuing fear among many in the city for their physical safety and also their financial livelihoods. People were told what physicians they might use, what lawyers might practice, what merchants might do business. Personnel men would refuse to employ men unless they had been passed by the boss. All city insurance and all surety bonds for contractors working for the city or county had to be negotiated through one insurance broker. Respectable businessmen soon found it a matter of safety to have Pendergast or McElroy, his henchman, and now the city manager, identified with them in their concerns. In some instances, they received blocks of stocks. In others, they were paid for serving on executive boards. However, in spite of everything I've just described, the Pendergast machine by 1938 was rapidly developing both internal and external stresses. Multiple reform forces worked to oust the Pendergast dynasty. Governor Stark, working with Democrats statewide, began to mobilize to thwart Pendergast's efforts to control state government. A particularly important action by Stark, and this becomes critical later in this story, was to appoint new members of the Kansas City Board of Elections, individuals who were not under the thumb of the machine. In Jackson County, a judicial investigation of machine activities was underway, and fraud and evasion charges against Pendergast by the federal government were proceeding under the leadership of Maurice Milligan. As a result of all of that, there was an increasing awareness throughout the citizenry, regardless of what part of Kansas City people might live or Jackson County, that there was trouble afoot in the city. A compelling example was the realization that the city had a deficit of over $1.5 million in the general operating fund, which led to city employees not being paid for the last 4 months in 1939. After the 1940 elections, that $1.5 million was determined not to have been the actual debt. Rather, it was $11 million. That was a lot of money in 1940. So heated encounters between Pendergast forces and individual citizens were on the increase. And a particularly graphic example occurred at City Hall. The wife of a city fireman called on Judge McElroy to protest his actions in cutting the wages and breaking up the union of the firemen. Armed with a leather whip, she was swinging lustily on the judge when his attendants went to the rescue. They attempted to explain the women's action by charging that she was intoxicated. And she admitted that she had had a nickel beer, which was all she could afford on her husband's salary of $67 a month. So finally, in rapid succession, Pendergast was indicted in April of 1939. McElroy resigned as city manager, and anti-machine reform efforts began to coalesce. Several different organizations were formed. Months of work went into the efforts of organizing and beginning to coordinate whatever those efforts needed to be in upcoming elections. However, remnants of the Pendergast machine still controlled City Hall, including the city clerk's office. So, as the citizens were circulating petitions for there to be an election, they were able to get 100,000 names on the recall petitions, which would have obviously recalled that mayor and city council, which would have set up a situation for a new election. Over 100,000 signatures. Behind closed doors, the city clerk and his staff circulated among themselves a list of 20 questionable factors which could disqualify a signer of the petition. As a result, the city clerk struck so many names that only 42,000 out of over 100,000 remained. And this was an inadequate number to warrant a recall election. Predictably, the citizens were outraged, and this episode lent much credibility to efforts of the reformers to galvanize the community. So the reform leaders went back to the drawing board, recognizing that initiative petitions, not recall, but initiative petitions, were approved by the Board of Elections rather than the city clerk. And remember what I mentioned about what Governor Stark had done? He had appointed a new board of city elections made up of reformers rather than Pendergast machine individuals. So as a result, a campaign was launched for a charter change that would reduce from 4 years to 2 the terms of office of the mayor and city council. And if that passed, that would mean that within a few weeks, that mayor and city council would be out of office and there would be the setting for a new election. So that was really the catalyst that enabled this effort to move forward. The reform organizations were created and then came together, and one of the most visible of those organizations that took the lead in bringing all the rest into the fold was Forward Kansas City. And it was made up of many prominent business leaders, all male. And then an executive committee of Forward Kansas City was formed, and 3 women were chosen to serve on that executive committee. That was a real breakthrough in terms of women getting directly involved in the reform efforts. So the initiative petition drive gained momentum. It was recognized that if the drive was successful and the subsequent charter change resulting in a reduction from 4 years to 2 passed, that a second election would be required in short order. So the strategy was threefold: get enough signatures on the charter change petitions, be successful in an election to get the term reduction, and shortly thereafter elect a reform-minded mayor and city council. So the first election date was projected to be February 13th, 1940, and if successful, the second election would be held 7 weeks later on April 2nd. So everybody went to work. The women's organizations, many of them for the first time, decided that they would get involved in a political effort. They'd shied away from it in the past, and yet they recognized that now was the time to step up, be involved, and be an important part of the changes that needed to occur. So, typical of the mindset of increasing numbers of Kansas City women were the comments of Mrs. Susie Robinson, who was a volunteer with the emerging United Campaign Committee. She said, "We women have been ashamed of our city too long. We've apologized to our young people too much. The time is here for a thorough house cleaning of City Hall. Women who use their home and tea and bridge parties as an excuse to shirk their civic responsibilities are placing an added burden on the rest of us who do want a fine city in which to live." So that was, I think, a very accurate description of how women were changing their minds about holding back and deciding to move forward. So as that first group of women met, representatives from all of the different women's organizations who had decided to come on board together, at that first meeting, these were some of the topics that they focused on. The announcement of a poster and cartoon contest to illustrate the political situation in Kansas City, plans to schedule large numbers of informational meetings throughout the city regarding the need for reform, and the sponsoring organization, which was the League of Women Voters, would provide the training for the women serving on the speaking panels at these informational meetings. Perhaps the most important decision those women made at that historic meeting was the selection of Mrs. George Gorton, Claude, as chair of the Women's Division, because she would prove to be the linchpin of the entire campaign effort. From the beginning of the women's campaign activities, there was a recognition that one of the challenges was to assure other women that it was safe to vote, that the voting process would be legal and confidential. As Mrs. Conger Smith, who was an active Republican in the campaign, stated, confidence must be built up in the thoughts of women, confidence that their ballots are secret and that they will be counted. So one of the first major efforts of the Women's Division was registering voters throughout the city for that initiative petition drive. Going door to door, hundreds of women contacted individuals to be sure they were registered and also prepared to vote on the two projected election days. After unregistered voters were identified, other women would drive them to the Board of Elections offices to officially register. Over 200 cars were used in that effort. A third group of women were telephoning citizens around the city to also identify individuals and make arrangements for the registration process. An agreement was reached with the Kansas City Star to print in their newspapers a form which citizens could fill out and mail into the election board identifying their new addresses. After being received and processed, the women volunteers again would prepare and mail postcards acknowledging that those citizens were now eligible to vote. 109,000 postcards were sent in the course of the campaign. I'm sure many of you here have been involved in political campaigns. So when I talk about the old-fashioned way, before we had social media, of reaching people, hand addressing 109,000 postcards, 2 or 3 people don't make that happen. It takes much larger numbers. That weekly slogan contest I mentioned was underway. Over 300 women typically voted in the selection process, and $5 was the prize. One winning slogan was offered by Miss Alma Bates. The old machine is out of fix. We now are wise to all their tricks. Our women brave with eyes so keen will help keep Kansas City clean. A more succinct entry was offered by Mr. Huffman. Kansas City's dirty dishes are in the sink, while most of the bosses are in the clink. And as was mentioned earlier, the symbol for the campaign was a broom. Those lapel pins were designed consisting of a miniature broom with a blue handle and red ribbons. And Mr. William Munger, one of the husbands of the women active in the reform effort, made the broom pins in his basement, and they were sold for $1 each to raise funds for the campaign. There was even a theme song for the reform efforts entitled "God Bless Our Town." It had new lyrics for an old favorite, "God Bless America," and was sung at many campaign events. So in January, moving up to that February 13th election, it became obvious that the efforts of the women were having an effect. The end result of all of the telephoning, going door to door, sending postcards, and participating in speaking events resulted in over 100,000 citizens signing the initiative petitions, which then enabled the Board of Election Commissioners to certify those petitions, and election day was formally set for February 13th. And on that election day, a huge volunteer effort was evident. Thousands of women, literally thousands, were active in getting citizens to the polls. 500 had been assigned to be on the phone all day, encouraging voter turnout, while 500 more women were in their cars, driving voters to and from the polls. Also, at every single precinct across the city, women were assigned to provide all-day oversight and support. There was an additional group of over 100 women preparing meals for the election judges in each precinct. In total, almost 8,000 women were involved as volunteers on that election day. And it was reported that, quote, at the polls, the women workers outnumbered the men workers 3-1. A 5-1 majority vote in favor of the charter change occurred. So the election was set April 2nd for a new mayor and city council. But prior to moving into that, on the 13th in that evening, and particularly the next day, the women celebrated. The day following the election, over 1,500 women gathered at the United Campaign headquarters. The Women's Division Chair, again Claude Gorton, led the gala by announcing that tea would not be served. Instead, it's going to be punch, fruit punch, with a brass band. So a cakewalk ensued, with the band playing Happy Days Are Here Again, followed by Roll Out the Barrel, with singing, hugs, and more flowers arriving on the scene all day long. One joyful male supporter told Mrs. Gorton that day, "I've just been to City Hall. They've got the flag and the pigeons all at half-mast." So, as Miss Gorton said, the women had been marvelous, and now it was time to get ready for the April 2nd election. So again, under the leadership of Claude Gorton, women mobilized telephone, transportation, and other committees to support the reform ticket, even as the ticket was being assembled. Reform mayoral candidate John Gage asked Claude Gorton to run for one of the council seats. She declined, which is regrettable as we look back, and yet she felt that it was still time for men to serve in that position. So recognition of the women's commitment to the reform efforts spread throughout the city and beyond. And at the April election day, as men seasoned in election day activities reported, quote, "The men were doing nothing in the 11th precinct of the 7th ward. The women were getting out darn near the whole vote, and it's a good big vote too." He then described that he had 17 women just in his precinct driving cars, telephoning, and passing out cards to procrastinators. Another male poll worker noted that there were 12 women doing their bit, and they've been up since dawn, telephoning and driving, and they don't even stop to eat. I watched them, and I don't know of one of them that's taken off for lunch. And in the 8th ward, a male observer commented, "The biggest part of the vote we've got so far has been cast by women. The women aren't only working, they're voting. Women that never voted before in their lives have come in here today and voted." So Election Day on April 2nd, 1940 produced a record turnout and an overwhelming victory for the anti-machine reformers. Their candidate, John Gage, was elected mayor, and all but one of the reformers' state of city council candidates, that slate, were elected. So again, the celebrations began. Praise came from all across the state. It was recognized throughout the country that something amazing had happened in Kansas City. The efforts of male civic leaders, coupled with the enormous outpouring of involvement on the part of so many women, had enabled what some would have said 2 or 3 years before could never happen. And it did. The ladies with their brooms, their leaders and admirers, generated so much enthusiasm that years later that movement was continuing and resulted in the formation of the Citizens Association, which is still a reform-based organization in Kansas City to this day. I do want to close by saying once again that Claude Gorton was an amazing leader. She worked morning, afternoons, and evenings for months to lead the women and to work with the men in their leadership positions to have that election be won. And it was very interesting that a reporter looking back decades later said Mrs. Gorton was one of the most gracious women this city has ever known. She was thoughtful, considerate, and kind. She even had a sixth sense about what people wanted and wished to believe in. At a campaign event, referring to a Pendergast machine leader, she said, "That man who's been stealing your votes called you little people. Let me tell you, you're as big as he is, and you're as big as I am, because you have a vote that is the same size and power as my vote. The real little people are trying to steal this election again." 25 years later, another political reporter, reflecting on Claude Gorton's leadership, said, "If she had been a man, she'd have been president." Thank you. Any questions or comments? And I will repeat what you asked. Yes, ma'am.
About that time, what would have been the south part of Kansas City? Would it have been as far as 95th Street or 63rd or?
No, South Kansas City at that time would have been 31st Street South, maybe 45th, 31st to 45th. There wasn't much, as some of you may know, as certainly I did when I was growing up in St. Joe and then after college, even south of 75th Street in the early 60s, there was not a huge amount of development. So it was pretty far north to be referred to as South Side. Other comments? Questions? Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm a big admirer of your cousin.
Yes.
Surely you must have meant great uncle because he's obviously decades older than you. But
Decades.
my real question is, could you speak a little bit to how much influence the Pendergast machine had on state politics? Because the humorous line that I've heard was that they call the governor's mansion Pendergast cabinet.
I did not do a lot of research on that. I did enough, though, to know that Pendergast, was beginning to encroach on state government and had gotten very involved in a couple of state gubernatorial races. And in fact, as I recall, and correct me if I am not remembering this accurately, I believe at one point he was supporting Stark when Stark first was involved politically, and even I think when he first ran for governor. So it was considered a real act of treason by Pendergast when Stark then saw the handwriting on the wall and backed off from his relationship with Pendergast. I think I have that accurately portrayed. But certainly he was very interested in expanding his empire, so to speak, beyond Kansas City and Jackson County.
What was he indicted for?
Tax evasion,
Okay.
yes. Yes, sir.
How did he become so powerful in a short period of time? I mean, I know you said his relative had preceded him, but...
I think that was a factor in terms of how did he gain so much power and seemingly so quickly. Actually, if you look at the history of the Pendergasts, who, by the way, were from St. Joseph, and James Pendergast, his older brother, came to Kansas City and started a small hotel and a big bar in the West Bottoms. He was known for being very kind, and he had an agenda and was very kind toward those in poverty, not only in the West Bottoms but beyond. So he began to develop a reputation of somebody who would really help you out. And from that then, Jim Pendergast developed this political clout. Then when his brother Tom began to get involved, that foundation was already there. So I think that made a big difference. It was not Tom Pendergast just appearing on the scene and being able to build all of that himself. He certainly was able to build on what his brother had initially created. Thank you all. I've really enjoyed being with you. Have a good evening.
I got another question. What about Pendergast and Truman? What was the relationship between those two, or do you know anything about that?
The relationship between Pendergast and Truman, when Truman was running for office in Jackson County, Pendergast was supportive of him. I think sometimes their relationship has been portrayed to be a closer relationship than it actually was. I think it was a very political relationship. And again, Truman saw the handwriting on the wall as all of the reform efforts began, and Pendergast was in trouble with the feds. and he backed off. So I don't know that there is as much intrigue about that other than the kind of political relationships people sometimes build. I could tell you a couple of stories about myself, but I won't. Yes.
Did you know any of these ladies? Were they still around when you were getting that?
I did not know any of them personally. There were a few who were quite elderly. I don't know that any of them are living now. I did not have conversations with any of them directly. I certainly admire, though, what they were able to do. They were certainly role models for all of us. Thank you.